If you have a Bible this morning, you can turn to the book of Jonah. And as I said, if you're new to Bible reading, listen. The book of Jonah, if you find the New Testament, if you find the book of Matthew in the New Testament, first book in the New Testament, and go back about 7 books, you'll find the book of Jonah. It's between Obadiah and Micah. Don't start at Genesis, you'll never get there, okay? But the book of Jonah, one of the minor prophets of the Old Testament, wonderful story. We're studying this because I truly do believe that Jonah's story is really all of our stories. Let me recap to where we've been, because Jonah was asked by God to do something, frankly, that he didn't want to do. Jonah was the only prophet under the Old Testament that God actually sent to the non-Israeli people, to a pagan culture that didn't worship the God of Israel. But God said to Jonah, I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh. But you see, Jonah understood who these people were. And he really didn't want to do that. And so what did he do? He decided to run from God. And I believe there are times in our lives when God has attempted to get our attention, when God has wanted us to do something and we didn't want any part of it. We say, God, you know what? I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to get as far away from that as I can. So Jonah, instead of going as he was directed by the Lord to go to the city of Nineveh, he went as far as he could go to get away from it. Take a look at this map again for a moment. Where he was in Israel, the flight up to Nineveh, that was about over 500 miles that he was supposed to go northeast. He was supposed to go that way. But Jonah got on a boat. He went to the city of Joppa, which was a port city, got on a boat heading for Tarshish. Tarshish in modern-day Spain. That was as far as you could run in the ancient world, because all they really understood was the Mediterranean Sea. Nobody's kind of sailed the Atlantic and stuff. So Tarshish was as far away as you get. And sometimes when we're running from God, we try to go in the total opposite direction, get as far away from the situation as we. But in the course of it, as Jonah was on that ship, you know, that would have taken him over a year by sea. And he was running from God. And what's fascinating to me is he got on a boat, which when we're running from God, we can do some pretty stupid stuff. And on that boat, a great storm came. And in the midst of that storm, God was attempting to get Jonah's attention. All the sailors, everybody else realized there was a problem. And we need to figure out from God what the problem is. Jonah was sleeping downstairs. The captain went, woke him up, said, call on your God. And Jonah said, guys, listen, this storm is my fault. And often it's what we're running to that creates our storms. Because some of you today, you're in a storm. Situations have not gone the way you've planned, and things are in an upheaval. And often our storms are the result of what we're running to, not just what we're running from. See, many times when people are running from God, they're running to something else. They're running to a relationship. They're running to a career path. They're running to something to get away from what they know God wants them to do, because maybe they have misconceptions or wrong ideas about what that would bring to their life, but they don't want no part of that. And so they run away from it, and often our storms are created. And so what happens? Jonah tells the sailors, listen, it's my fault, throw me overboard. They're like, no, we don't want to kill you, man. So they try to, row back to shore. They try everything they can. They realize that the storm only got worse. So they said, okay, God, please forgive us for taking this man's life. We don't know what else to do. Heave ho, they threw him into the ocean. And the Bible said that God created a great fish to swallow Jonah. You know, and that's where people have sometimes difficulty. They can lose the point because they find the story that's a whale of a tale. There's something that's hard to swallow. And I don't want you to miss what's going on here or the message that God's bringing to us because of that end. But the fish comes up and swallows Jonah. And here was Jonah. Now God had his full attention. And see, some of you, you're in a condition today that's of your own making. You're in the belly of a whale, proverbially. You don't know where to go. You feel trapped. You have nowhere to turn. Maybe the financial condition of your life has left you absolutely, subject to some condition that you don't control. Maybe you're in a relationship. Maybe you're in some other dilemma of your own making. But now God's got your attention. You see, Jonah, he realized something, and anybody who runs from God comes to this realization that you can run from God, but you can't outrun God. God is there even in the midst of it. And he does all this to gain our attention. Why? Because he's waiting for us. He's hoping in one sense that we would turn back, because God is abundant in his mercy and his grace. But here's what Jonah realized and came to understand. But God is also thorough in his discipline. You see, God's discipline comes into our life not because God is angry at us. That's what you all need to understand. God's discipline is wholly rooted in his love. Because here's the deal. God's discipline is never to pay us back, but it's always to win us back. God ministers it on. In fact, if God has done some things in your life this way, that's proof that he loves you. Here's what the Old Testament said and affirmed again in the New Testament. You have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as children. It says, do not despise the Lord's discipline, nor faint when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he disciplines and corrects every son that he receives. Because as any good parent understands, you discipline for one simple reason. You want your children to grow and to learn. And so in essence, God is abundant in his grace, but he's thorough in his discipline. You see, when God disciplined the nation of Israel, all the years that he sent to them prophets after prophet after prophet saying, turn from your idolatry and all these false gods that you worship along with me. You can't have it both ways, guys. And they wouldn't listen again and again and again and again. Finally, God's discipline arose, and they were taken captive to the nation of Babylon. Now, how long were they in Babylon? 70 years. Now, you would say, well, maybe 7 years would have been enough. But no, God let them there for 70 years. God's thorough in his discipline, but you know what? It's a fascinating reality about history. Israel never, ever worshiped idols again after that point. When they were released out of Babylon and returned to the nation of Israel, never did they ever again worship idols. They had other problems they dealt with, but they learned their lesson from that one. You see, God is that way. When do you all think, let me ask you, when do you think Jonah repented? Well, if he's anything like me, as soon as he hit the water, he's like, God, please forgive me. God, help me. It's like when you go to discipline your children, it's not after that you discipline them, they go, okay, I learned my lesson. No, they're negotiating right up front. I got it. You don't have to go through with that. I understand. I have messed up. I will never do that again. But any good parent realizes that you need to help your children to connect the reality that going this way, that, you know, sometimes the discomfort that we feel, God allows those situations because he wants us to associate discomfort with running from him. And you and I need to understand this point, because that's where I believe so many people are at. Maybe in some areas of your life you've surrendered to God, but there are things you're still holding out on. There are things you're still holding to in that end. And so if you found the book of Jonah, let's pick up today on this end. We're going to begin today at the end of chapter 2, verse 7. Jonah chapter 2 and verse 7. Because here's good news and encouragement to every one of us that are here today. Because in the midst of Jonah's troubles, in the midst of his rebellion and his running from God, God was still there from him. When Jonah prayed, the Lord heard him. The Lord had a plan for him. Lord was just waiting for this moment when he would finally come to his senses. And that's the way the Lord is for you and me. That he's waiting for those moments. So look at what it says here in Jonah 2 and verse 7. It says, and when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. Isn't it amazing that often the first time that people actually pray is when they get in trouble? Isn't that fascinating about human nature? Things get so bad, somebody says, man, we've tried everything we know to do. And he says to his friend, do you think we should pray? That often with humanity, We try all of our ways, all the levers we can pull, the buttons we can push, all of our own ways. And when we realize we can't get ourselves out of this mess, ding, 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 all of a sudden, maybe I should call on God. And that's just the way it is. Psalm 107 said it this way. Fools, because of their iniquities and because of their sins, are afflicted, and they cry out unto the Lord in their distress. And here's the greatness of God. And he hears them and delivers them out of all their troubles. He sent his word and healed them and delivered them from their destructions. Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. The entire psalm talks about how continually people get a palm opportunity where all of a sudden things are all right again, and the idea comes back, well, maybe I can do it my own way. But God is there for us. And so the good news that you need to take out, if God was there to listen to Jonah, God is there to listen to you today. God is waiting on us. And so Jonah says, again, in verse 7, and when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. And my prayer arose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, listen to this, salvation comes from the Lord. And the truth this morning is this, salvation comes from God. God's deliverance, God's ability to get you out of that mess that you created. That whale that you find yourself in. That situation that you have no control over. God's the same. He doesn't change. And salvation comes from the Lord. And Jonah realized this and cried out to God in the midst of his troubles. And the Lord heard him. And you and I need to realize, because often when a parent disciplines a child, everybody who knows this recognizes this. What's God waiting for? You see, God's waiting for one simple thing, for us to surrender. For us to raise the white flag. For us to say, you know what, God? And you know when you surrender? When you stop bargaining with God. When you stop trying to say, all right, I'll do this if. Surrender is when it's unconditional. Surrender is no longer about, God, what I want. It's just, God, I surrender. I want you. Help me, God. And God will help us in the midst of it. But often it's when we're in that place of being broken. Any good parent knows that. When you're dealing with your children, there comes a point when they finally submit. When they finally stop saying that they know better. That any good parent realizes that that's critical, because for them to recognize that they need to yield their will provides lessons for life. Because often we get stubborn and try to do things our way. But we need to associate the reality that when we surrender is when God's grace, when God's love, when God's mercy shows up. You see, those who cling to worthless idols, it says, surrender or sacrifice, forfeit the love of God. The reality is God loves us the entire time. God never stops loving us. But because we cling to things that we know God doesn't really want in our lives, we try to negotiate and bargain. All right, God, I'll do this, but don't touch this. Don't talk to me about that area. I might do this, but you see, until you come to that point of recognizing that there is the stuff that we have fought for really doesn't all matter in life. And sometimes it's not until we reach those points that we learn those lessons. If you're taking notes this morning, listen. Surrender begins when we realize the futility of our idols. Surrender begins when we realize the futility of our idols. What's an idol? An idol is anything we in our lives attempt to displace God with. See, sometimes an idol can be a career. Sometimes an idol can be a relationship. Sometimes an idol can be a hobby. It can be so many different things in our life because it's anything that we attempt to find fulfillment in apart from God. Then we think, in this area, no, God don't understand me. This is going to satisfy me. And God said, well, listen, when you cling to a worthless idol, then you forfeit I love you the entire time. God never stops loving us. The problem is often we don't experience his love because we fight, we run, we cling to things that really don't matter. And so Jonah learned this lesson. He was penning this years after. And the lesson that he learned inside of there was that all that he ran from was really just an idol. It was worthless. And you and I need to recognize, because why? When you surrender, because you think we have these ways of trying to figure out how we can get around and kind of get everything we want from God and still have it our way. Aren't we masters about trying that? We try to have our cake and eat it too, like somehow God doesn't recognize. And so he allows us to remain right in that situation sometimes, right there, until we finally raise the white flag and say, God, you know what? I surrender. And so Jonah surrendered, and what did God do? God had the whale or the fish spit him out on dry land. And notice this. Now pick up in chapter 3 and verse 1. Look at this. And the word of the Lord came to Jonah, what? A what? A second time. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. Listen, in the Hebrew, I put this in your notes. It's a shani. A shani. God gives every one of us a shani. And sometimes, see, the word really literally means again. A second chance. God will come to you again and again and again. God has been dealing with some of you here this morning a long time about certain areas of your life. Because you're surrendered in some parts of your life, but you got holdout areas. You got stuff that you're still clinging to. You got areas that I am not going there, God. And God comes to you, Shanae. He comes to you again. Ashini, he says, come. Here's a second opportunity. And you know what? For many of you today is a second chance. God is giving you a second chance because that's what his grace is all about. Aren't you glad that God's not like other human beings? Because some people, when we offend them, some people, when we neglect them, when we do them wrong, they cut us out. They said, you ain't getting a second chance out of me. Forget you, pal. You out. God will always give you a second chance. Listen, if you're taking notes this morning, listen. God will always provide a second chance to submit to his will. Notice that. A second chance to submit to his will. Not a second chance so that you can attempt to bargain and negotiate again. No, God says, wait a minute. I'm the Lord. I don't change. And when you come my way, it really is a better way. If you could understand it from my perspective, but this is what you have to trust. And always with God, God is a father, but he is also God. And because he's God, here's a biggie for us. He knows more than we do. We attempt to say, I know better. And we do. Don't we do that? Especially when we're young. Well, I know better than my parents. I know better than God. I know better than anybody else out there. And later in life, we come to realize, you know what? My parents weren't as stupid as I thought they were. You know, Mark Twain, when he was 18 years old, and then they interviewed him and said when he was 25 years old, he said, you know, when I was 18, I thought my parents were the most stupid people on the face of the earth. By the time I was 25, I was surprised by how much they had learned. You and I realize, because why? It is in those ends that we kind of come to grips that God really knew better, and that's why he comes again and again and again. He'll take, like he did with Israel, he kept coming around the mountain. Okay, guys, are you ready to go into the promised land and trust me? Okay, let's go around again. And some of you, you've been in this situation far too long. And the whole time, God is now coming to you this morning again with a shani. And he's saying, it's a second chance. It's another opportunity. Will you surrender? Will you raise the white flag? Will you stop trying to negotiate and do it your way? Can you do it my way? The word of the Lord came a second time unto Jonah. Notice this. And then what happened? Jonah decided that he was going to finally listen, obey God. Jonah obeyed, let me pick it up again. The word of the Lord came a second time unto Jonah. And you got to realize, he says, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. God didn't change the thing. Jonah didn't want to do that the first time, but notice what God came to him again with. What he didn't want to do the first time. See, God's giving you a second chance today. See, some of you, God's been trying to deal with you about your financial situations. And he's saying, I'm giving you a second chance. You need to stop the spending habits and recognize where the problem's coming from. You need to relinquish. You need to start trusting me. You need to start turning it over to me. Some of you, you're trying to figure out how to fix your marriage. God says, I've given you the wisdom. Will you do it my way? I'm coming to you a second time. Will you do it my way? You see, God comes to us, but he always comes back to the same issue. And what he said to Jonah was, I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim the message that I've given you. And you see here, if you're taking notes this morning, maturity is determined by our lag time. Lag, L-A-G, lag time. Which means what? It's funny because I've been around Christians so much. I mean, it's occupational hazard. Listen, when you're around a lot of people, because it's kind of funny, people who know the Lord will say stuff like this. Oh, the Lord's been dealing with me about that for a while. Yeah, one of these days I'm going to really do the Lord's will. Like, that's kind of like a joke. You see, maturity is determined in the lag time. When God tells you to do something, how quick do you respond? Because you know what that tells? How much do you trust him? How much do you know him? Because if you really know him, you'll never question his will. Because you'll know he knows more than you. That he's got a good thing in mind for you, never a bad thing in mind. But that comes as a point of trust, at a point of maturity. As you grow in God, you begin to realize, you know what? Doing what God says is the best thing I could ever do. So whenever I determine that this is what God is saying, I'm going to just do it right away. Because you know why? Procrastinating, putting it off, which we're all masters of, is the opportunity for the enemy to get in and keep you thinking, yeah, I'm going to do it. But don't do it. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. But you don't actually get to that. Maturity is determined in our lag time, the ability for us to respond to what God is saying. You see, Jonah, he gave him the opportunity. He spit him out on the shore. Jonah says, all right, God comes to him a second time. I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim against it the message. Jonah, look at verse 3. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord. And you and I need to recognize, Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord, but he had time. Because from the point to which God spit him onto the shore, it was a good 500-mile journey to get to the city of Nineveh. And often with God, when we say, God, I will do what you say do, God will give you some time because your determination to do it. When God spoke to Abraham and said, Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, and take him up into a mountain that I will show you and sacrifice him there. Do you know that God gave him a 3-day journey? Why? To see if he would turn back. To see if he would think about it again. And why is that? Because often this is a truth about human nature. When relief comes and God intervenes and God shows up and delivers us out of that problem, and we say, you know what, God, I'm going to do what you say do. God gives us some time because you know why? Many times with human beings, when we get some relief, we rethink about it again and we don't actually follow it through. We don't actually do what the Lord commands us to do. But listen to me. If you're taking notes this morning, listen. Surrender is always displayed in the simple act of obedience. Surrender is always displayed in the simple act of obedience. Jonah, he set out. It says again in verse 3, and Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was a very large city, and it took 3 days to go through it. See, it's never actually surrender until you actually do what God tells you to do. See, we have this idea because why? As human nature, we generally judge other people by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. Well, because I intend to get to that, I've kind of credited it to my account that I'm going to do that. But surrender is never surrender till you actually do it. Till you actually do what God says do. Now notice in verse 4, Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city. Notice this, it said Jonah began. The word began in the Hebrew language literally means to untie. It literally means to unclutter. It means to give up control. And that's the problem so often. We may verbalize surrender, but we haven't actually given up control. You see, the things that God is asking you to surrender in your life, maybe there are areas you've been stumbling at time and time and time again, and there is a solution that God's shown you, but you haven't wanted to give up control of it. Maybe giving up your password for your computer to your spouse. Maybe giving up control is allowing somebody else to oversee the financial affairs and not you trying to control it all the time. Maybe giving up control is just simply saying, you know what? I am not going to make the final determination. I have determined to surrender to God, and I'm going to make myself accountable to somebody as an accountability partner to make sure that I follow through. Because that's true surrender. You see, Jonah began, he got rid of all the reasons why that journey, that he was not going to do it. And now Jonah was set, man. He took that journey. I have no idea, 500 miles, how long it would take him to walk that part. But he arrived at the city of Nineveh ready to do it. Because you know why? Jonah was fearless at that point. I guess if you spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a big fish, well, I mean, what are you going to... It's kind of like when the Pharisees threatened Lazarus after Jesus had raised him from the dead. The Bible says that the Pharisees had planned to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus. Like, that would be something he'd be scared of. I mean, he was already dead and back to life again. I mean, what do you got as a threat at that moment? If God could deliver Jonah from the greatest concern of all, then maybe I can just trust that what he's told me to do, he'll cover me. He'll have my back. God will take care of me. And so Jonah went, and he proclaimed the message, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. And notice this next phrase, I love it. It says, and the Ninevites believed, listen, what's the next word? God. They didn't believe Jonah, they believed God. Notice this. The Ninevites believed God, a fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. And when Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he arose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued to Nineveh. By decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people, now listen to this, really, wow, this is wild, or animals, herds or flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat, or look at this, or drink. Do you think these folks were serious? I mean, it's a pagan culture, guys. Do not let them eat or drink. But let the people and the animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. With compassion, or urgently call upon God, let them give up their evil ways, and notice this again, and their violence. You think they didn't know what they were doing wrong? Remember I told you in the first week, the Syrian culture, which was capitalized with Nineveh, was a very violent culture. Horrible things that they did to torture their enemies. To give up their violence. See, what you think that is impossible to reach, why would people like this ever listen to God? God always knows more than we know. And notice this. He going on to say to them, who knows? God may relent with compassion, turn from his face anger, so that we will not perish. And when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. The Ninevites believed God, and here's the thing you need to understand. This is a fascinating story when you look at it because, you see, God is always up to far more than what we can recognize. You see, God was working not just to teach his prophet a lesson and to save his prophet. God had the people of Nineveh on his mind. God cared about the culture. The things that we don't think God cares about, often God cares about more than we can understand. And we don't know how to reach them, but God knows exactly how to reach them. And God was up to things. Why? Why would a pagan culture that didn't worship the Lord all of a sudden turn and experience the greatest revival that we've ever seen in human history when an entire culture, an entire people turn to the living God from their violence, from their evil, from their ways, and repent before God? You see, God was up to things far before Jonah ever showed up. You see, extra biblical text, when you look at history, you find out right before Jonah was to go there, you see the Assyrian culture was threatened. 3 different tribes, 3 different people had rallied together, and they were threatening to attack the nation of Syria, okay? Secondly, they had experienced 2 plagues in the last 5 years that had devastated much of the population. And right before Jonah showed up, they had experienced a full eclipse of the sun. Now, in pagan cultures, in ancient cultures, that was always a significant thing. See, God was up to something. And listen, this is how cool it is, because Jonah wouldn't have even known this. And why did God have a great fish? Because unknown to Jonah, but known to God, that one of the gods that the pagans in Nineveh worshipped was the god called Dagon. Dagon was half human, half fish. And here, think about this. Jonah, he probably looked like a freak. He'd been in a fish's belly for 3 days. Probably all his skin was bleached. Probably all his hair was off of him, including his eyebrows and everything else. He must have looked like a real freak show. But God knew, because all of a sudden the story of a fish belching out a man on the shore got the attention of a pagan culture more than Jonah could have ever even begun to recognize. Because his message wasn't good news. His message wasn't, unless Nineveh changed in 40 days, it'll be overthrown. But they listened to him. They sought God and said, maybe, just maybe, God will have compassion on us if we change. See, God knows how to reach us and reach people far more than we do. But what it requires is simply somebody that will obey. Jonah was running because he had no idea what God was going to do. Jonah figured maybe God was sending him to his end, that the violence of the Syrian culture he was going to experience. He had all of his reasons why obeying God wasn't a good idea. That's why he was running from God. But what he didn't realize, God is God, and God knows what he's doing. He's not sending his prophet there to sacrifice his life. Here's the good news, guys. God always has you on his mind, but that's not all he has. He has your family on his mind. He has your neighborhood on his mind. He has your community on his mind. And maybe, just maybe, if we surrendered and we didn't understand why God was asking us to do something, that if we actually did what God said do, if we actually threw up our hands and said, God, I'm not going to fight you anymore. I'm going to surrender to you. I'm going to raise the white flag, that God would do far more than we ever began to imagine that God would do. See, God is speaking to us today because there are things he wants to do in your life. There are things he wants to do in the lives of people close to you. There is things he wants to do in the lives of people that you don't even understand what God will do if you would simply surrender to God in these areas of your life. You say, well, what would it mean if I did this to God? Well, you have no idea what it would mean. You have no idea what God will do. And that's the thing, you have to surrender that God's God. He knows the end from the beginning. He knows exactly why. But you see, Jonah, he was only concerned about one thing. I don't want to be in a fish's belly. Running from God is really not what it, painted itself up to be, not what I imagined it would be. I ain't summering in Tarshish, hanging out at the beach. I am in a mess. And that may be where some of you are at today. You may be a mess of your own creation. But what you need to recognize is this. If you're taking notes, listen. Grace is the outcome of surrender. Grace is the outcome of surrender. You see, God's grace is more than just his favor. God's grace is his empowerment to do things in our lives that we're incapable of doing in our own strength. But God does them by his grace. And God is wanting to do things in your life, but until you surrender. See, we try to bargain and say, God, if you do this and if you do that, then I'll do this. And God said, whoa, 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 you got it backwards. What you need to recognize is I am God. And because I am God, if you do what I ask you to do, I'll do far more than you ever thought or imagined, but you got to let me be God. You're not calling the shots, I'm calling the shots. And here's what the scripture says. Listen to this. Proverbs 3:34 says, he mocks the proud mockers, but gives grace to the humble. See, when we cling to certain things and say, God, no, you can't touch this. Maybe you can have some of this over here, and then guess what? He's not in charge. There's only one way Jesus comes into a life. Listen to me. Jesus doesn't come on the installment plan. You can't pay for him over time. Jesus only comes one way into a human life. He comes as Lord. Which in other words, you got to relinquish control. See, some of you here today, God's been after you for a while. He's got your attention because of things going on in your life. The issue is, will you surrender your life to God? Will you give your life to God? Some of you, there are areas of your life where God's been attempting to get through to you. And right now, today is a Shanae, another time, another opportunity, a second chance. But will you surrender it to God? Here's what James said in the New Testament. He said in James 4:6, but he gives more grace. That is why Scripture says God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Here was a pagan culture that didn't even have faith in God, and they turned to God. And what did God do? God met them right at the home of their surrender. God relented from all that had come. Did they deserve destruction? Did they deserve punishment? Sure. They were a violent and wicked people, but they turned to God. And in the midst of their surrender, God gave them grace. Did Jonah deserve a second chance? When Jonah was in the belly of that fish, he had been running from God. He had a relationship with God. He knew the goodness of God, and yet he ran from God. But God gave him a second chance. And when Jonah finally said, gets it, God, I'll do what I said I would do. I will pay my vows. I'm going to let go of my worthless idols. I'm going to surrender. I'm going to raise the white flag. God met him right where he was at. And God did for Jonah far more than Jonah would have ever thought. Jonah's memorialized today. Now, thousands of years after this man lived on the face of the earth, we're still talking about him today. There's a whole book of the Bible that's been dedicated to him. Why? Because most of what is written about Jonah's life has all to do with this story. It has to do with a simple surrender that says, you know what, God, running from you is not a good idea. My life is yours. I surrender. And then God does through Jonah something that people are talking about still to this day, that an entire pagan culture, see, you may think the conditions of your neighborhood, you may think the conditions of your city, you may think the conditions of your nation are beyond help, are beyond hope, but God is still the same God. And what does it require? See, when Jonah simply said, God, I surrender, what Nineveh needed was simply someone that would go to them, somebody that would go where nobody else wanted to go. Everybody was either scared to go or the people just didn't care about what was going on. But God cared, and God was saying, I'm trying to get a hold of you. I've been knocking on the door of your heart. There are things I want you to do in your life, but until you surrender, till you raise the white flag, till you say, that's it. God, I'm not bargaining anymore. I'm not going to try to get it on my terms. God, I have come to realize that it's on your terms and your terms only. That's when God's grace flows in our life. That's when we experience the love of God in such a real and powerful way. When we understand that grace is the outcome of surrender. When we give up, God shows up. When we give up, we experience God's favor, which is better than anything that we ever tried to cling to, that we ever tried to hold on to, that ultimately was killing us to begin with. It didn't provide life to us. It wasn't giving us all that we done, but yet we're stubborn as human beings. We hold on. Things may not have gone the way we thought they would go by doing it our way, but yet surrendering to God, I'm not sure. But God's saying, hey, I'm waiting. I'm right here. I'm still right today, giving you a second chance. I'm giving you another opportunity, and now is the time. Right now is the place that you can find a Shanae, a second chance, another opportunity.